Trade tensions with this move today from China to ban the sales of these rare minerals to the U.S. effective immediately.
On Tuesday, China responded with export curbs of its own, announcing an immediate ban on the sales of critical minerals gallium, germanium, antimony, and super hard materials to the United States.
The trade war between China and the U.S. is not ending anytime soon. It started in 2018 during Trump's first term, and now that he is about to start his second term, both countries have been throwing economic blows at each other. And just like how the US threw the first blow at China, this time is no different. In response, China threw a massive blow to the US, which has placed some critical sectors, such as the agricultural sector, in jeopardy. According to the reports, China slashed US imports worth $690 billion. This is massive. But the question is, can the US survive this? Let's find out. When Trump started his protectionist policies, which targeted China specifically, it seemed he forgot that the US depended on China in some critical sectors. You see, for years farmers in the United States lived and farmed knowing that they had a reliable and big buyer of their produce, specifically soybeans. While Brazil is currently the top producer of soybeans in the world, the US comes second. And China has been the largest buyer of US soybeans. However, Trump's changed everything. With the recent trade conflict between both countries, China has decided to cut back its US soybeans imports from 40% in 2016 to 18% in 2024. This is a massive drop, and you can only imagine how America's soybean farmers are taking it. US states like Iowa and Nebraska are experiencing job losses, bankruptcy, and financial ruin. It's such a shame that the US agricultural sector, which has been a staple of the economy for generations, is now facing a battle for survival, all because of the trade war between China and the US. But can you really blame China for making this move? Just like how the US has touted its targeted trade policies at China as protecting its national interest, China is also doing the same. The only problem is that it is the consumers and the producers, specifically in America, that are feeling the brunt of these policies. Now, some analysts and US politicians are hoping that other markets will step in to take China's place. While that is true, it doesn't change the fact that it will take some time, and it might not be possible to fully replace China as a result of its large purchasing power. But beyond a direct effect on the US soybean sector, China's policy is also affecting industries related to the sector. This includes machinery manufacturers, logistic companies, and even small businesses that depend on the soybeans trade. But here is a question that you are probably asking. Is this policy not affecting China? Where will China get its soybeans from? Well, besides the fact that China is among the biggest producers of soybeans in the world, China has begun to diversify its markets by strengthening ties with other countries, including Brazil. As we said earlier, Brazil is currently the largest producer and exporter of soybeans in the world. Interestingly, it used to be the United States, but in 2013, Brazil surpassed the US in soybeans exports for the first time. And since then, Brazil's share of the global soybean trade has continued to grow, with its exports reaching 3.7 billion bushels in 2023. But China is not just looking for new markets. The trade war with the US has emphasized the need for self-dependence. So, China has begun to invest in new technologies and infrastructures to support its agricultural sector. This is a long-term reorientation of China's trade and investment strategy that cuts across every sector of China's economy. Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. It's no surprise then that China is employing a similar strategy in its technology sector. For a long time, the US has been dominant in the semiconductor industry and has shown no sign of allowing any country to take its place. But beyond maintaining its position, the US has specifically targeted China's semiconductor industry. A few weeks ago, the US launched its third crackdown against China's semiconductor industry in 3 years. According to the reports, this latest move was one of President Biden's last large-scale efforts to staunch China's ability to access and produce chips, which the US says will help advance artificial intelligence for military purposes and strengthen its national security. The crackdown entails a new set of export controls, restricting the sale of crucial semiconductor manufacturing equipment and high-bandwidth computer memory to China. In response, China retaliated by banning the outright sale of a number of materials crucial for the production of semiconductors and electric vehicle batteries to the US. These critical materials include gallium, germanium, antimony, and other super-hard materials, which are all necessary for the production of semiconductors and electric batteries. But beyond this move, China has focused on a strategy that is based on self-reliance and self-sufficiency. In recent years, China has been doubling down on the independence of its technology sector. The Made in China initiative, for example, has been in full swing. The Chinese government has made massive investments in the semiconductor industry, and tech giants are now on a mission to build their chips. But China is not just building and improving its semiconductor capabilities. It is also positioning itself as a future tech leader with the rise of 5G, artificial intelligence, and other advanced technologies. The US might have wanted to use its dominance in the semiconductor industry to its advantage, but the truth is, the US ended up pushing China into focusing on self-sufficiency. By strengthening its semiconductor industry, China is ensuring that it will not be vulnerable to future tariffs or trade war with the US. The energy sector is also not left out. In recent years, China has been quietly shifting away from US energy and turning to non-US allies for its energy supplies. These countries included Russia, Iran, and Qatar, with which China has been building and deepening ties. This year, for example, China signed a landmark 30-year natural gas deal with Russia. China also signed a $60 billion natural deal with Qatar. It's obvious that all these moves are not just about getting cheap energy deals. It's about reducing dependence on the US. By reducing reliance on US energy, China is not just securing a future where it controls its energy destiny. It is also ensuring that it will never be vulnerable to future political pressure or price hikes from the US. But here is a big question. Have the US-China trade relations always been this contentious? Well, it would interest you to know that since 1949, the US-China relations have been complex and tense, but also had long periods of cooperation. Trade between both countries started in 1784 with the departure of the merchant ship Empress of China from New York Harbor. The vessel was initially constructed as a privateer, but was later converted for commercial use. This was after the American Revolutionary War. The ship arrived in Canton in August 1784, where it exchanged its cargo for Chinese goods such as tea, silk, and porcelain. Following its successful return to New York, other American merchants began to engage in trade with China. This ushered in the era of the Old China trade. By the 19th century, the US trade with China had expanded, but it was also marked with tensions including the Opium Wars. One of the first major events between the United States and Chinese governments was the 1845 Treaty of Wangxia. Under this treaty, trade grew slowly with talk of a giant buyer's market in China, always making the rounds among American capitalists. Then came World War II, during which the US supported China's resistance against Japan. The US provided military aid, financial assistance, and personnel deployment, including the famous Flying Tigers. Following Japan's defeat in 1945, the Chinese Civil War resumed between the Nationalist Party KMT and the Communist Party CPC. During the Civil War, the Communists petitioned the US for support, but were unsuccessful. Instead, the US offered both military and financial support to the KMT, under the hopes that a united, democratic coalition government would be formed in China. However, despite the US support for the KMT party, the CPC prevailed. And on October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China, while the KMT retreated to Taiwan, maintaining its claim as the Republic of China. Following the Civil War, America only recognized the KMT-controlled Republic of China in Taiwan as a legitimate government, not the Communist People's Republic of China. Now, during the Cold War, the US sought to isolate the People's Republic of China through trade embargoes and restrictions on strategic imports. These measures were reinforced by direct military confrontations, such as the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. For instance, China's entry into the Korean War forced the US to freeze all Chinese assets in America. The United States also prohibited transfers of funds from the United States to recipients within the PRC, which also cut off funding for American-influenced institutions in the PRC, such as Christian colleges. China retaliated by seizing all American assets and properties, totaling $196.8 million. The PRC also began efforts to remove American cultural influence from China, including by nationalizing cultural institutions affiliated with the United States. However, changing geopolitics led to a gradual thaw in the tensions between both countries. And in 1972, President Richard Nixon made a historic visit to China, ultimately marking a sea change in U.S.-China relations. President Nixon's visit led to the issuance of the Shanghai Communique in February 1972. This document established a framework for future cooperation between both countries. It also allowed both countries to express their respective stance on key issues, especially regarding Taiwan. This eventually paved the way for increased trade and diplomatic engagement. On January 1, 1979, the U.S. formally established diplomatic relations with the PRC and recognized it as the sole legitimate government of China. However, it did not cease its military support for the ROC on Taiwan, working within the framework of the Taiwan Relations Act, with this issue continuing as a major point of contention between the two countries to the present day. From the 1980s, China began to implement market-oriented reforms, moving from a centrally planned economy to one that is market-driven. These reforms aimed to modernize the Chinese economy and encouraged foreign investment. The shift in China's policy attracted significant foreign investment and opened the way for its eventual integration into the WTO in 2001. China's accession to the WTO marked a significant milestone in its economic development, as well as its relations with the U.S. The U.S.-China bilateral trade surged within this period, with total goods trade increasing from less than $100 billion in 1999 to over $500 billion in 2019. However, the advent of the Xi administration led to a sharp downturn in U.S.-China relations, and it was further entrenched upon the election of President Donald Trump, who had promised a combative stance towards China as a part of his campaign, which began to be implemented upon his taking office. Issues included China's militarization of the South China Sea, alleged manipulation of the Chinese currency, and Chinese espionage in the United States. In 2017, Trump's administration labeled China a strategic competitor, and the following year, Trump launched a trade war with China, which the Chinese characterized as part of the unjustified containment strategy begun by the American pivot towards Asia. The United States government banned American companies from selling equipment to various Chinese companies linked to human rights abuses in Xinjiang, among them, which included Chinese technology conglomerates Huawei and ZTE. The U.S. revoked preferential treatment towards Hong Kong after the passage of a broad-reaching security law in the city, increasing visa restrictions on students from China. The U.S. also began to impose tariffs on Chinese goods, with the initial tariffs hitting $34 billion worth of goods. Subsequently, the tariffs expanded to $250 billion worth of Chinese goods. In response, China retaliated by imposing tariffs on U.S. agricultural products like soybeans and pork. By 2019, the U.S. had imposed tariffs on more than $360 billion worth of goods, and China retaliated with tariffs worth more than $110 billion of U.S. products. These tariffs significantly increased the costs of U.S. businesses reliant on Chinese imported products. And the worst part is that they had to pass the burden of the costs to American consumers who had to purchase the goods at a higher price. But that wasn't all. American farmers, especially soybeans farmers, saw their sales drop as China turned to alternative suppliers like Brazil. To offset these losses, the U.S. had to provide over $28 billion in aid to farmers between 2018 and 2020. What this simply means is that the U.S. suffered the most from these tariffs. Meanwhile, China's exports to the U.S. declined in certain sectors, including machinery and electronics, as a result of the tariffs. This is because China had to implement other measures such as diversifying its export market and increasing its domestic consumption. Now, with the recent ban on U.S. imports, the U.S. economy is on the verge of a crisis. The big question is, will it survive? What do you think? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel if you have not done so already.